Welcome again to the Forum Book Club. Here we are again. Vivian Dudro, Father Fessio at Ignatius Press, Joseph Pearce in South Carolina. And we're going to begin discussion on a wonderful book, a very useful book, a very practical and well-written book called 111 Questions on Islam by Samir Khalil Samir, S.J. And this is a book which is tremendously informative, very balanced. He's someone who grew up in Egypt, became a Jesuit. He works in Lebanon. He lived in the Arab world. Of course, he speaks Arabic. He's read all the sources. He's worked with Islamic Christian dialogue. I met him maybe 10 years ago now. Every year, Pope Benedict would continue his annual meeting of the Schülerkreis, the students, his doctoral students, and we have a theme, and we have presenters whom we ask to come and make a presentation. And one year, the theme was Islam and Christianity, and we invited Father Samir to come, and that's why I met him, and that's what led me to ask him to do this book for us, or to at least let us know about the books he had written, and which we did, translated this. But it's a fabulous book. So we're taking right now the first two sections. Joseph, I'll turn it back over to you, our host.
Yeah, first of all, I'm pleased that you began as you did there, Father, because my first question, had you not done that, was to ask you to let us, including me, know more about Father Samir, because I know nothing about him. So that was very useful. I don't think you said, unless I wasn't paying attention, where he's actually from originally. You said he lives in Lebanon.
He's from.
Is he an Arab?
He's from Egypt.
He's Egyptian. Okay, thanks very much for that, Vivian. So yes, I have a confession to make here that I don't know if this is Providence or not, but I still know next to nothing about Islam. But I was actually at a conference at Christendom College a few days ago, and there was a lecture that I attended by a historian at Christendom College on Islam. So I thought this is perfect, providentially, because it means it gives me some background information to inform me more as we go into this discussion for this book. But then when I started looking at the book on the way home from that conference, I realized there are contradictions between this book and that lecture. So again, as usual, I'm someone who's probably going to introduce an element of controversy to the discussion.
Well, go ahead.
Well, I mean, the key one, as far as I can see, I mean, let me go towards the first. I want to say very briefly, by the way, I love the contents here, because the contents, they're very detailed and they actually frame the questions. So you don't have to read the book from page one. You can actually you can read the index, read the contents and go to the pages that interest you. I think that's very helpful. And I did want to say that first. But in the early pages here, and I'm not sure I'm going to be able to find it straight away here, but the Father Samir basically takes at face value the Muslim claim that the Quran was written down within 2 decades of the death of Muhammad. And one of the key components of this lecture by the historian at Christendom, who had actually done some extensive research into Islam, I asked him exactly, where that was, is that the problem is that much of, he said there were virtually no Christians in the Arab Peninsula. There were Jews, but virtually no Christians. So Muhammad would have had very little direct contact with Christianity. And yet much of the Quran is quite clearly an engagement theologically with the claims of Christianity. And he says that the textual evidence for the Quran is no finalized version of the Quran until the 9th century, which is, of course, 2.5 centuries or so after the death of Muhammad. So and that, of course, raises all sorts of textual questions as regards the validity of the claims of the Quran itself. And Father Samir seems to take on face value that the Quran was finalized within 2 decades of Muhammad's death, and so that seems to me to be something which we need to know the answer to before we could discuss much of the other, these theological aspects. Well, no, not theological. The authority of the Quran, right? The authority of the Quran textually.
Well, of course, a couple of things there. One, most uh, faithful Muslims would not permit textual criticism of the Quran because it's supposed to be directly dictated by God.
Yes.
Whether it was written down, 2-3 decades after the death of Muhammad, which would have been 634, he died, I think, 632. I mean, would have been in the 7th century, or whether it was another century or two before it was written down. Either way, there was nothing written when he died. It had been memorized by groups of people, and according to Father Samir, they decided we need to put this in writing, and so they got these various people who had memorized it, the exact words of God, and yet they didn't always agree with each other, and so there's already kind of an editorial process that took place. But so from both those positions, what you heard and what Father Samir said. By the way, let's try and get him on at the end of the book, and we'll ask him his question, see what he.
Yes, I would obviously love to do that, and it's just that obviously that if this historian is correct, and that Muhammad would have known very little about Christianity, because you've had the very little direct engagement with Christianity, because there were very few Christians in the Arab Peninsula. There were Jews, but not Christians at that time during his lifetime. Then all of the dialogue with Christianity would be something that could not have, well, of course, what the Muslims would claim was that he knew it because it was the angel that told him. But on the assumption we don't believe that, then the point is that all of this stuff would have been unknown to Muhammad, and was basically a later. So in other words, the text of the Quran were actually composed decades, possibly well over a century after. I mean, not all of it, obviously, but large parts of it, because large parts of it are clearly a dialectic with Christian theology.
Well, a couple of things about that. One, by the 6th and 7th century A.D., even Jews knew about Christianity. So it wasn't as if you encountered Jews that knew nothing about Christianity. Secondly,
No, Father,
wait a minute.
sorry.
Wait a
Yeah,
minute.
the Jews were everywhere, but Muhammad was on the Arab Peninsula, a particular specific local area where the Christianity had not penetrated at that point. The Jews were obviously the diasporas of all over the Middle East and beyond, but the particular pagan tribe of which Muhammad was a part had no direct engagement with Christianity, according to this historian.
You didn't hear what I said. I didn't say direct. I said the Jews of that time, after 600 years after Christ, 580 years after Christ, some of them have heard about Christianity, especially when we think about they're only 100 miles away from Alexandria. I mean, Egypt was a huge center in the Copts. So to say that no one in the area of the Arabian Peninsula knew anything about Christianity just because there's no Christians there, first of all, that's implausible. Secondly, my understanding is that there were Aryan Christians that were there in the Arabian Peninsula. And they certainly, the Nestorian church, was a Middle Eastern church. This is a trade route. I mean, I'm not sure it's easy to make the case that Muhammad had no knowledge of Christianity because there were no Christians in Arabia. But maybe
well, that's a good point, and you are right, of course, that Muhammad married that widow who appeared to be a merchant and had owned loads of camels, and therefore, of course, there were trade routes, and Muhammad would have been part of that business. So that's a good point. I mean, all that I'm doing here, as is my wont, and as you know, is bringing an edge of controversy in so that we can address it. But I've only got that one lecture to go on and this book to go on, and I have no other way of testing it because I have no knowledge of Islam.
As you're speaking here, if there's trade that is centered somehow in the Arabian Peninsula, as her trade was, where's that trade going?
Well, yeah, I think it was not in the Arab Peninsula.
Wait a minute. Let me finish my
I
little
beg your pardon.
paragraph here, okay?
Beg your pardon.
I mean, clearly the trade route was from Persia and, the Euphrates through Damascus and Lebanon down to Egypt. That was the trade route. You know? So there was a huge amount of exchange from Egypt to Persia. How someone who ran a trade company wouldn't know something about the cultures and the religion of the people they're trading with, to me, it's kind of hard to.
That's a good question. I wish that I'd thought of asking this historian.
Well, and what was the extent of the Roman Empire? I mean, there was a lot of movement and commerce. I mean, thinking even of the first Pentecost, when Peter goes out and addresses the crowds, and there's this long list of where all these people have come from. Jews spread throughout the whole empire, Medes and Parthians and this and that and this and that from everywhere, who've gathered in Jerusalem for Pentecost. And so, there was just so much movement of peoples because of the Pax Romana. But I would say we don't even have to resolve this question ourselves to have a fruitful conversation, because whether Muhammad wrote it, whether someone else wrote it, the fact is that this religion is having a huge impact on the world and on the church. And I think we can still go to the pertinent questions about how this religion is practiced today, and the confrontation with the West that's going on today, and we can solve some of these historic questions later.
Well, yeah, I agree. I mean, we're talking about Islam, 111 questions on Islam. Obviously, there's a whole panorama there, and one aspect of that spectrum would be, the validity of the Muslim holy books. But it's not the only question, of course. I mean, you are completely correct. It's a very fast-growing religion. I mean, the two, if you like, the three powers that are fighting for the soul of the world are secularism, Christianity, and Islam. So yeah, I agree. Geopolitically, geospiritually, Islam is a major issue. I was merely raising one aspect. It's obviously not the end of the conversation.
Right, and I think that let's take Muslims on the basis of their beliefs. I mean, they believe the Quran is a sacred book. They believe that God dictated through the angel Gabriel to Muhammad, that he memorized these things and others did, and that gave us the Quran. And therefore, any speculation about whether it might have been influenced 2 centuries later, I mean, their response is going to be, hey, look, the angels knew it all. We didn't need any Christians inside.
Agreed. But the point is that, but their perspective is not our perspective, and it's a valid part of the conversation to offer our perspective to the textual evidence.
Right.
Well, getting into the text itself, I mean, Father Samir does emphasize in the beginning that Muhammad's main target audience were the pagans living in the area of Mecca and Medina. I mean, he was not principally concerned with Jews and Christians at all initially. That came later, and so that was interesting. That what really got him upset was all this polytheistic paganism. He was trying to bring people to worship the one true God. He was certainly right about that.
And no matter, one of the problems with doing history of antiquity is that I don't believe it will ever be possible to show beyond reasonable doubt that the Quran was written 2 centuries after the Muslims think it was written because of these influences. I mean, that may be true, and it may be even probable and plausible, but it's not probative. And so I think we have to say, look, this is the book they consider sacred. What is in the book? And at the beginning, these first couple of chapters.
Well, I would just reiterate that they're two different questions, and they're both valid questions. I'm happy having addressed the issue and having had you up to a point throw question upon the issue that I wrote. That I wrote. I'm happy to move on. But they're both valid questions. We discussed that valid question I'm happy to move on to other valid
All right,
questions.
let's move on, as they say. I mean, a couple of things which I thought were very helpful in the first part of the book is he does give a good explanation of the origin of Islam. I mean, who Muhammad was, how it grew, how it went from Mecca to Medina, and so on. And I think, by the way, I just want to show that little thing on here while we're here.
Oh, I love maps.
You like maps?
Oh, I love maps. Yeah.
I'll put this on the screen here. This is a little map of Saudi Arabia. You can see Yemen down below, and then Omar over there. But there's Medina up in the upper left, and Mecca down below, a little further to the left. And so it started in Mecca, went to Medina, came back to Mecca, and then I wanted also to show this. This is the Ka'al. How do they say it?
Kaaba.
Kaaba. Yeah, this is that cubicle building, and that you're looking at, one of the pilgrimages they've made there, and this is a close-up.
And that was, originally a pantheon to many gods. This place of pilgrimage predates Islam, and the people would come. It was like a pantheon of gods. But after the adoption of Islam, it became strictly Islamic.
Right, and Muhammad destroyed all the other idols that were there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, so that's where it took place. So we got the origin, we got the 5 pillars. That was good to know. I always memorize them and forget them, but the 5 basic truths or pillars of the Islamic faith. And of course, prayer is central there, and they pray several times a day. So all this was good to kind of know more about.
The thing that I found interesting about his discussion of the 5 pillars was Father Samir's explanation that from a Muslim point of view, these are juridical. These are juridical practices. In other words, it's very different from a Christian understanding of an interiority, of an internal transformation of the person into Christ and so on. That this has to do strictly with if you do these things in the precise way outlined, you've done them. And if you don't do it this way and that way, you haven't done them. And your interior disposition and so on has nothing to do with it.
It's like the Irish when you praise the rosary. Hail Mary, Hail Mary, Hail Mary, Hail Mary. Doesn't say the whole prayer, but I did the rosary now, Excuse me, all you Irish out there.
Now, see, now you're getting controversial with the Italian American criticizing the Irish. Now, it doesn't matter what I say about Islam. Now, I'm going to be in the right now because you're the Italian American attack the Irish. So there you are. I have one thing with page 34 that I'd like to discuss because I think this is important for Catholics. That Father Samir says at the end of the top paragraph there on page 34. They speak negatively about Allah as a means to criticize Muslims. They act as if Allah were a divinity that belongs solely to Islam. I think this is a question we need to discuss because the Allah of Islam, is it the same God that we Christians worship? Bearing in mind that we believe in the incarnation, we believe in the Trinity, and the sort of, should we say, the sort of worldview, the sort of theology that comes from Allah, the Islamic understanding of God, is that really the same as the Christian God or the Jewish God? I think I have a problem with that. I'm gonna do my usual quote C.S. Lewis. I mean, I think that Lewis in The Last Battle, when he talks about Tash and Aslan, he's talking about some of the pagan gods as well, but it certainly has the Arabic Allah and the Christian God in mind when he distinguishes between Tash and Aslan, and the ecumenism that leads to people talking about Tashlan, I would suggest is problematic. And those two sentences imply that when we're attacking Allah, we're attacking God. And I'm not sure that that's fair.
Well, I don't think that's what he's saying. I don't, even though he's showing that the word Allah for this one true God or over God or whatever, he's saying it predates Islam, and that it was commonly held belief in the region before Muhammad comes on the scene. Then he goes on to, explain more technically these differences. There's Abdallah and there's Al Rahman and so on, to show that there were differences between Jews and Christians and Muslims in how they understood God. But so I don't think he's trying to say that what the Muslims ascribe to God are exactly the same attributes that Christians ascribe to God and vice versa. I don't think he's saying that. I simply think
I think he's using an etymological argument. He's saying that Allah etymologically means God, and therefore there's nothing wrong with using the word Allah for God. In an etymological sense, of course, that's true. But words do change meanings, and the word Allah now does not mean God in the same way that Jesus means God. And
right.
I mean, and I think that distinction is important when we're using words.
Right.
But I would say, here's my definitive answer to this whole controversy in question.
Let's hear it.
Anyway, that in the sense, in a broad sociological sense, man's heart is made for God. We recognize some being. Most people throughout history have recognized some supreme being. Even when you have a bunch of gods, there's one who's the top god.
Like Zeus.
That's Zeus, or before Zeus, Kronos. But so Muslims and Christians, in one sense, believe in the same God. If you believe there's a power beyond the universe, who created it and is Lord over it, yeah, we believe in the same God. Jews, Christians, Muslims believe in the same God. But that's kind of blurry. When you start to focus a little bit, and well, if you think about God, how do you describe him? What attributes does he have? Then the Christian God and the Islamic God, God and Allah, are completely different beings. For one thing, even apart from the incarnation of the Trinity, which of course is huge, there's a whole distinction between logos and will. I mean, the Christian idea is that God is bound by his own reason. That is, God cannot make a square circle. God cannot change the commandment and saying murder is good. I mean, he can only do what is according to logos. Whereas the Allah, for those who think it through, it's a voluntaristic God. In other words, God commands not to kill because it's his command, and he could change his command. It would be just as right to kill. And it's a completely different view of God. But again, is the God of Christians the same God as the God of Muslims? Yes and no. There's only one God, but their view of him, as you zoom in, is contradictory to the view of Christians, I would say. Joseph, would you buy that?
No, I agree with all of that, and I actually am very grateful for your mentioning other difference in the attributes of the Christian God from the Islamic God, including in things such as will and the voluntarism of the Islamic God. I just question nothing you've said, but I mean, Father Samir sort of seems to criticize for instance, the law in Malaysia that says that Christians cannot use the word Allah when talking about the Christian God. I mean, for me, one of the things we need with language is definition, right? And if it seems to me, if you're going to have a word such as Allah, which distinguishes specifically the Islamic understanding of God, we should be grateful for that because it makes it easier for us to talk to each other. And I don't know why we would complain about that and let the Christians talk about God with a different word so that we can be distinct and definite in the way that we use words. I don't see what the problem is. I know that Father Samir is.
Time out.
Yeah.
Joseph, the word Allah means God.
Yes, I know.
Okay, so it's like us saying, well, Muslims are going to call their God God. We call our God God. We get into a different word. Well, wait a minute. Don't take my word away from me. That's my word for God. That's my word. Allah is the Malaysian word, both for Christians and for Muslims. You can't tell them that, well, because the Muslims use it and they have a different definition, you got to get rid of that word. It's like I telling us to get rid of the word God.
Yeah, all right, okay, time out. I agree with that, and let it never be said, Father, that I do not set down when a good point is made against me.
Okay, good. We'll try and reciprocate, but of course, there aren't many good points made against us, right?
Right.
Uh, yeah, exactly.
Uh, uh, but it may come up later in the book, but in the Quran there are 99 different names that are used for God, or attributes of God. God is mercy. God is justice and all sort of stuff. But the two names which are not there, out of the 99 names for God, Father is not one of the names,
Interesting.
and love is not one of the names. And you talk about a difference between the Christianity of God.
Yeah.
I mean,
Right.
God is love, God is Father. I mean,
Yeah.
So there's a huge discrepancy there.
Yeah. Agreed. Well,
Uh,
I'm going to shut up and let Vivian say something.
Well, back to things that really made me think and learn. I like the juridical point I made earlier. That so here's another example of this language, Joseph. I talk about prayer, they talk about prayer, but in fact, we might be talking about different things. Not that there's not some element to it that we do hold in common, but there are these distinctions that are important. Another thing I learned from these first sections was the communal strength of Islam and how it's not simply a religion the way we understand religion, a set of beliefs, maybe even a set of practices, but that there's a whole social, political dimension to Islam that Muslims don't consider their faith complete unless all these dimensions are there. And this is actually a strength, as he points out, because Muslims can't really be Muslims in the Western world without the fullness of the community. But as I thought about it, and can I be a Christian without the church? I mean, this strength that they have is to their credit, actually. And the fact that we are running up against a competition, if you will, in places such as Africa and so on, where Islam is spreading like crazy, it makes me realize we need to get our game back.
well, yeah, we should reinstitute fast on Fridays,
Yeah.
and we should celebrate the, Immaculate Conception, close our schools on December 8th, and not put all our feast days on Sunday. I mean, Ascension Thursday should be on a Thursday. Why? Because these are outward signs of our belonging to a
Right.
community which has a particular core set of beliefs.
And they're beliefs that are shared and lived and practiced in communion with others,
Yeah.
and how important that is for a religion to retain its vitality.
And
Right.
even if it becomes dead, I mean, if you keep those customs, let's say Ascension Thursday, and so we don't work on Ascension Thursday, we close our schools, we go to Mass, even if you're not even practicing your faith very much, that outward sign is there, and your kid or your grandkid is going to say, what's this all about? And we'll come back to the faith. But you've got to have these outward incarnate events and gestures in order to maintain the community.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that Islam makes demands, and that is actually attractive. And somehow or other, from the 1960s onwards, the leadership of the church, not all of it, but many leaders in the church, thought that basically Christian practice was onerous, and we had to make things as simple and easy as possible, and that the path of least resistance led to heaven. And and clearly that's not the case, and that's the problem.
Now,
Yeah.
bringing up the ease of it, didn't you find interesting where Father Samir says, in a certain sense, Islam is easier than Christianity? In spite of these outward practices that are insisted upon, there's a certain elements to it that make it easier to live than Christianity. What did he mean by that? I don't remember. I'm looking in my.
Oh, okay, that wasn't a rhetorical question.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Well, one thing is the example of Ramadan. You fast all day, but then as soon as the sun goes down, you have a big feast. But here's the thing that makes it really easy. It's a masculine religion. I mean, what are the two, I would say, most masculine temptations? Sex and violence, right? I mean, that men want to be men by doing that. Well, Islam lets you have 4 wives plus mistresses, and it specializes in holy war. You be a martyr by getting yourself killed or killing someone else. Uh, I mean, it basically sanctifies the most masculine temptations that we've got. And so, of course, why are there so many young men that want to become Muslims? Well,
Well, and this goes back to this difference between Christianity, which demands an entire transformation of the person into Christ. Thankfully, not simply on our own strength, because that's impossible. But it demands a transformation. And what you just said, Islam doesn't demand that men give up those things. It simply gives them a sanctified and justified um, application of those things, which, by the way, were improvements over the Bedouin life of the Arabian Peninsula before Muhammad got there. I mean, that's something that I often forget, that polygamy, for example, that was already practiced, and the treatment of women was actually worse before Muhammad got there than after the institution of Islamic law or warfare. They were already warring against each other in that culture, but Islam actually brought a certain discipline to warfare, when you could fight and when you couldn't, and who were your enemies and who were not, that wasn't there before. So even though it seems to us in Western society as barbaric or something, it's no, actually there was something worse before they got there, in terms of the Bedouin pagan tribal society.
So I read something in, I think it was the UK's Daily Telegraph a couple of days ago, about basically the brothel of several dozen women that ISIL used. Basically, the women were shared amongst all the men, amongst these ISIL warriors for Islam. Now, I'm assuming that's not bona fide Islamic
did
law.
you say ISIL or ISIS? I thought you said ISIL.
Well, yeah, sorry. In the UK, they still call it ISIL, Islamic State in the Levant.
I've seen that. Yeah.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Islamic State in the Levant rather than Islamic State in Syria. Sorry, I should have said ISIL. I beg your pardon. The mystery for me is, if this is so, what on earth? Why do so many millions of women submit to Islam so contentedly? Apparently.
What do you think, Vivian?
Well, one way to go about this: why do Western women who already live in Western society convert? And I did see a very interesting interview with, I think she was in the UK, college educated, a career, and she converted to Islam and became voluntarily a wife of a holy warrior. I don't remember which, if it was ISIS or something else. And when she was asked why she converted, she said, well, her life as a modern, liberated Western woman was meaningless, had no purpose, had no transcendent purpose. She lived just according to her whims each day. There was no structure or order to her life. And that when she became Muslim, she was given a rule of life, an order that gave meaning to her life, and she felt more fulfilled as a fully veiled Muslim married to a holy warrior than the woman she was before. And, we in the church who are interested in evangelization have got to look at that and say, wow, are we not giving our own people out of our own tradition that would have given her meaning, order, purpose, family life? It answered some need. And so back to your question, well, what about the women in these Muslim societies? Why do they put up with it? Well, when they look at the West, especially the West they see on TV, and in the movies. They think what we have is an abomination compared to the life of order and purpose and family life that they already have. They don't want to trade what they have for what we're offering.
And I mean, I think there's something in the nature of woman that desires a kind of submission, not a slavish submission, but if there's no alternative, I mean, if the only way you can be a woman by having some kind of authority over you or submit to someone is by becoming a Muslim, well, maybe that's the attraction.
Well, maybe so. One thing I would say as well, if this Muslim convert lady that you mentioned was British, I would say that she would have no idea whatsoever about what authentic Christianity was. That the
Right?
UK,
No, exactly.
I
Exactly
mean, she's
right.
such a secular country. What she was really doing was she was looking for meaning and purpose, and she discovered Islam because Islam is probably more present, quite frankly, as an alternative to the secular hedonistic culture than
Right.
Christianity, which for the most part in the UK is cowardly.
Right. So this does make some sense. This is not.
Yes, that was actually very enlightening. Thank you, thank you very much for that, Vivian. Yeah, I'm getting lots of answers here.
Well, this raises a question too, which comes up in one of these headings here: Can Islam change? Uh, and as Ratzinger pointed out a couple of times, and as Pope, the West went through the Enlightenment period, which may be an darkening, but nevertheless, there was a greater focus on human rights, individual responsibility and freedom and dignity and so on, and that hasn't taken place in Islam. But there's a fundamental difference in the way the Catholic Church is structured and the way Islam is structured. And just 2 points on that. One, we've talked about already, the Islamic scripture can't be interpreted except it can't be put into historical context. It's God's tongue, it's God's language, do with what you can. Secondly, there's no authority in Islam that they can authenticate a change. And when we had the meeting in Rome, I mentioned at the very beginning here, and the question came up about this change, and it was Pope Benedict who said, well, the fundamental problem with Islam is there's no magisterium. There's no pope. There's no one that can make a definitive decision on behalf of all of Islam. And therefore, as he says here, because you've got these two sets of text, the peaceful text and the violent text, I mean, who can say that if I'm following the violent text, I'm not a good Muslim? Or if I'm a Sufi, I'm not a good Muslim? No one can say.
I would say as well that throughout history we forget this because there seems to be a unity up to a point in Islam today because of certainly their united approach to Israel and to the great Satan in the West, the United States, and what have you. But throughout history, the Muslims have spent most of the time fighting amongst themselves. So that's one of the reasons why they were conquered by the West was the fact that they were never united. They unite against a common enemy, so the Crusades or Israel or the United States. But when they don't have that common enemy to unite them, they end up cutting each other's throats.
Right.
Well, there's there's the two main branches, the Sunni and the Shia, and but that dates all the way back to the death of Muhammad, right? The successor, the question of a successor was not peacefully resolved, and so now these two bodies of Islam are at war with each other. But you're right. If they have a common enemy to fight, they will unite against that, which in this case is us.
Right.
I want to quote at page 50 at the very bottom. It must be stated again that there is no juridical authority similar to that of the bishops or the Pope in the Roman Catholic Church. But there are surahs, or at least verses in surahs, which are contradictory. And so on page 70, Father Samir tells us, confronted with these contradictory verses, the Muslim tradition was obliged to find a method of interpretation called the principle of abrogating and the abrogated. And so if they could figure out which ones came first, they would say, well, because God is a voluntaristic God, he can change his mind, And so we got to find out what he said. Well, the most recent thing he said is after which he stopped talking, so that's definitive. And on that same page at the bottom, it says, Muslim scholars unanimously distinguish the surahs of the Mecca period, 610 to 622, from those of the Medina period, 622 to 632, because when he started out, he had to be peaceful because he was in a minority. He had to leave Mecca to go to Medina, and then he built up this army, came back to Mecca and conquered it. Well, now he was in charge. And so you get the first, the earlier verses are the Pacific ones, and the later ones are the bellicose ones. Something else related to that, on page 65, and this is important here in the West, because Islam means submission. Jihad means spiritual struggle, right? He says no, but a third of the way from the bottom here on page 65. The word Islam derives from the verb aslama, which means to submit or to abandon oneself to. Therefore, Islam is the act of abandoning oneself or submitting oneself to God. It does not mean to put oneself in a state of peace. Further down, it's interesting to note that the first biographers of the founder are not named Sirah, biographies, as they came to be called in the 3rd century of the Hijra, the 9th century of the Christian era, but Kitab al-Maghazi, that is the book of the raids, because he had about 2 raids a year for 10 years while he established Islam. But, I'm sorry to keep going here, but I want to make one more point. We talk about the violence in Islam and the holy wars, but if you read the Old Testament and the wars that Joshua fought, I was struck in the second week Office of Readings. It is Psalm 44. This is inspired word of God. It was you, my King, my God, who granted victories to Jacob. Through you, we beat down our foes. In your name, we trampled our aggressors. Praise God, we beat our foes, we trampled on them. I mean, hey, it sounds like jihad to me. But here's the key. I'll be brief on this. But Isaiah chapter 61. You've heard this before. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good tidings to the afflicted. He sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prisons to those who are bound, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor and the day of vengeance of our God. So this didn't have verse numbers until I think the 15th or 14th century, but it had sentence, full sentence and so on. Verse 2 continues verse 1, and so verse 2a is to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor, comma, and verse 2b is, and the day of the vengeance of our God. And so the Old Testament had this idea that when God was going to appear, he was going to give us favor and save us. He was also going to crush our enemies. So what does Jesus do? Luke 4:21. Actually, 4:16, sorry. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up, and he went to the synagogue, as was his custom, on the Sabbath day. And he stood up to read. And there was given to him the book of the prophet Isaiah. Now, it wasn't a book because he had scrolls in. Isaiah is one of the longest books in the Old Testament, so 66 chapters, so there's probably several scrolls. But providentially, he's given this particular scroll. He opened the book and found the place where it was written. So, again, no chapter numbers, no verse numbers. He obviously knew the Bible, but he goes to this very passage, Isaiah 61. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set at liberty those who are oppressed, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord, period. And he closed the book and gave it back to the attendant. and sat down, and the eyes of all in the synagogue were fixed on him. And he began to say to them, "Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing." Wait a second. He picks up the scroll, opens it up, 61, and he stops in the middle of the sentence. To proclaim liberty to the captives, comma, he closes the book. He does not say, "and day of vengeance of our God." So Christ is the interpreter of the Old Testament. And so, whereas I think you could say Joshua and Muhammad were very similar in the way they went about their work. I mean, Joshua basically conquered all the tribes, in Canaan. But that wasn't the final message. We have an abrogation too, in a sense. The New Testament doesn't abrogate the Old, but it gives a proper interpretation of the Old. And so, people who claim that, oh well, Christianity is just as much a religion of jihad and war as Islam is, no. The Old Testament had them both, grace and battle, but Christ came and showed that he was not the Messiah they expected. He was not going to overcome by raiding tribes and by gathering a people through military force, but through sacrificial love. So that's the huge difference between Christianity, which has already interpreted the Old Testament and has a magisterium that can refine the teaching as time goes on, not change it, but refine it, whereas Islam is fixed by its own principles in 7th century Saudi Arabia.
Amen. Amen.
People say, of course, but what about the Crusades? What about the Crusades? And Father Samir very deftly handles the Crusades, doesn't he? On page 72, he says that, starting on 71, the fundamental difference, the Crusaders or the Christians who fought the war did not pretend to have done it based on the Gospels. They did it in defense of Christianity or for the defense of their state or the defense of what they considered to be their rights. That is to say, men belonging to a culture, a nation, tradition, they went to war. They did not act in the name of the gospel. And then he explains the whole background about the Christians being gradually more and more fiercely persecuted in the Holy Land and it getting worse and worse. And then the destruction of churches and so on. But this was really interesting to me. Father Samir says, the Crusades were not considered wars of religion, not even by the Arab historians of those times.
I was impressed by that too. Yeah.
Anyway, I'm not justifying what every crusader did by any means, but people often throw that out to try to say that Christianity has its holy wars too, and they're no different from the jihad.
Right, and the First Crusade was actually not the First Crusade. That is, before they went to the Holy Land, it was in Spain and Italy. They'd been attacked by in the 10th century. Rome was overrun. That's why there's a wall around the Vatican now to protect them from the Muslims who were attacking. And so the first military action was actually done in the Mediterranean off the coast of Spain between them and Algeria because they were trying to protect themselves from the pirates. I mean,
the Barbary pirates.
The Barbary pirates. So, and then there were people who want to make pilgrimages to the Holy Land. It's our Holy Land after all. I mean, Jesus was there. The Old Testament was there. And they were getting robbed. They were getting killed. So, yeah, we can't justify everything each crusader did.
No.
But, so that's one point. That it was not a religious war. It was a political protection. But secondly, it was prior to the Enlightenment. I mean, the Enlightenment did make a change within Christianity and stop the religious wars among Christians, at least for a time. Joseph, I've been dominating you.
I know. I think that this has been a somewhat lengthy session. I think we should probably think about wrapping up. Should I give the page the assigned readings for next week's
Okay.
book club? So obviously today we've just read the first two parts. There's 5 parts of this book. So parts 1 and 2, which takes us up to page 90. So for the next week, can we read together part 3 and part 4, which takes us from page 90 through to page 175, 176. And we'll conclude part 5 the following week.
Sounds good. And then if we haven't covered in this first section any issues that you're interested in knowing what we think about, go to the forum. You go to ignatius.com and you'll see how you can get to it from there. And then pose a question. We'll look at those questions and give you an answer next week. Okay. Thanks all. God bless you. See you next week.